Hey guys, Youngblood with you, and today I wanted to cover the topic of the medical profession in Star Citizen, which was featured recently in a design post in conjunction with the Apollo sale, as well as in Reverse the Verse discussions, and where they reference back to the Death of a Spaceman post from about 5 years back. Now, I think what makes the most sense here is to start with the Death of a Spaceman and hit on the medical portions of that, because the majority of that information is still relevant. Now, the idea behind the life and death of your character is that you have death, and then you have permanent deaths. And Chris Roberts likes to think of older games where you have a set of a number of lives before you just lose the game. The primary difference here isn't that you're going to lose your stuff completely, but instead you end up having a beneficiary that would step in and fill your space. Now, each character is going to have a set number of lives that they can utilize before you just flat out get worn out and need to move on for good, moving on to your beneficiary or your next of kin. Essentially, you're going to start out with your character, and for simplicity, we're just going to call him Player 1. Player 1 dies once, but then is revived, and then in order to get you back up and running, they had to replace your leg with a robotic version. Player 1 goes out and dies again, and comes back and now needs a cybernetic eyeball. Player 1 then goes out and dies again, and now needs a new hand. And eventually, you're going to start ending up being more Darth Vader than Luke Skywalker, and you're just going to cease to exist. Now, that wasn't me saying that Anakin Skywalker wasn't relevant there, but, Luke lost a hand, Anakin became Darth Vader, there's your analogy. But either way, you're going to end up passing on your items to your next character, who you end up setting up when you build out your first character, and that player ends up taking over, and we'll call that one Player 2. So it's not a total clean slate, because they can still get items you had before, minus whatever upgrades or your cargo that weren't covered by your insurance, and then they get a little bit more. Some portion of your faction alliances and your reputations are inherited as well. So if Player 1 was a pirate, Player 2 is still going to be considered somewhat lawless by the reputation system. If Player 1 was a miner and with good alliance to the miners union, then Player 2 is still going to have some of that good favor associated with them. Neither situation leaves you in the same place as Player 2 that Player 1 was, but it's also not wiped out completely either. So that's the general mechanic, but there is a lot more to it. For example, when you're killed, you're going to be spawning in a medical facility unless you're in a permanent death situation, and then you'll be at your own funeral, but as Player 2. While this info is about 5 years old now, the plan was that you'd be able to die at least 6 times before having to swap to Player 2. You're probably going to be able to find ways to increase that number, though, through gameplay or missions or paying money to have someone grow you an organic version of a body part to regain some time. I think the idea there being that you're not cybernetic, you're actually back to some version of you. You can also do other things to try and avoid dying in the first place, such as increasing your ship's capabilities or improving the escape pod system or life support. And you could have more support, medical ships in your convoy. It's about playing smart to prevent these things in the first place, and that could be as simple as avoiding dangerous parts of space too. Now, as of 2013, things like not getting out of a ship before it blows up, dying in your escape pod, or being shot in the face could always be ways that you die. And the headshot is supposed to be the worst type of injury, leading to death frequently, though you could end up just losing an eye or a jaw or an ear or something like that. And that's basically your summary from Death of a Spaceman on the medical portion of things. That being said, we've gotten some clarity or addendums to this information over the last several days. Medically speaking, there's now 3 tiers of injuries that come with varying levels of ways to be saved or healed. Tier 3 is the most minor type of injury, and that involves minor injuries like having a standard limb being injured. A Tier 2 injury is a moderate one, and that's, closer to a limb like bleeding out or being fully ruined. And then you get Tier 1, which is the most serious, and that's basically a life-threatening injury like a critical limb bleed out. Now, when you think of critical limbs, think of your head or your torso, with legs and arms being your standard limbs. Now, in conjunction with these types of injuries, there are associated medical beds or facilities of the same tiers. For example, a Tier 3 bed could repair a Tier 3 injury, or is able to buy you some time by stabilizing the person until you reach a location that can actually heal that level of injury. So for a Tier 2 injury, you could possibly keep that person alive for an currently undetermined amount of time, until you transport them to a more critical care location, whether that be a ship or a station or a planet. A Tier 1 injury you can technically stabilize to some extent, but you're going to have a lot less time to make it where you're going with only a Tier 3 bed. With a Tier 2 bed, you can heal a Tier 2 or a Tier 3 injury, but you can only stabilize a Tier 1 injury to reach a destination. And with a Tier 1 bed, you can basically heal or stabilize all injuries, making it more or less a full clinic. Tier 1 beds are much larger than Tier 3, meaning that you can carry fewer of them, and as we learned in the Apollo, you can only carry 1 Tier 1 instead of 3 Tier 3s. Depending on the ship, you might be able to not carry that at all. You know, you're also going to have varying damage states for your body parts, ranging from no damage, which has no visual indicator, to hurt, which is yellow, damaged, which is red, and ruined, which is black. And each of those comes with varying consequences, such as lack of mobility, slower speeds, blurred vision, bleeding out, and the severity increases from there. Bleeding out is going to be a consequence that is going to continue to cause problems over time. Bleeding out of a standard limb may just result in that limb being completely destroyed or completely ruined, to use a vernacular, while bleeding out from a critical limb would actually lead to death. Now, in addition to that, you have what's known as health pools, one for each limb and then an overall global health pool. If your health pool to a critical limb goes to 0, you're going to die. If your health pool to a standard limb drops and your global pool low enough, you're going to end up dying as well. Even having a relatively minor injury, you do need to plan on getting them fixed or you're going to start seeing consequences. And with your global pool continuing to fall, you're basically incentivized to do so. Even just a hurt limb is going to slow you down and increase the damage you take from other more minor incidents too. So it's always going to be in your best interest to get help as soon as you can and get yourself repaired. Now, as things sit today, the only way to heal yourself is to use a MediPen, which does take you back to 100%. But that's really rudimentary and not likely to stay as currently implemented. Now, as far as medical gameplay is concerned, the initial plans are to have 3 core types of missions. The first one's basically a medical delivery, which is going to consist of taking medical supplies and organs and tissue samples and others to different destinations. And it was mentioned that specific medical ships are probably going to have the facilities on board to keep organic and kind of bodily type materials safer for longer. So while you could use a freelancer, a Cutlass Red may do a better job. Then you have the recovery mission type, which is along the lines of a search and rescue, to where you're trying to find injured people, searching for them in debris fields or locations, and then providing assistance while potentially investigating and finding out that there's a bigger picture story behind it all. And then you have the big one, which is the rescue mission, which is like a station disaster, a large ship going down, an outbreak, or really anything where you need to provide aid on a larger scale by healing or transporting people and goods that are needed. And with the final mechanic, there's the respawning side of things. And we know that today, when you die, you end up in the last place that you spawned. So if you spawned at Grimhex and you go out and you die and you haven't logged out anywhere else, that's where you're going to be back to. Now, in the plans, if you end up dying, you're going to be spawning at a nearby medical station or ship. Now, if you're in a populated area like Hurston, you're probably going to be waking up in a fully functioning large hospital. But on a moon, you'd probably end up in a small clinic or a medical outpost. If there is a medical ship in the area, you're going to have the option to select that as a spawn location. But if it's a player-owned ship, you're probably going to have to hope that they've actually opened up their ship to that type of gameplay, and you're going to need to decide if you actually want to spawn on some random person's ship. Also with ships, they need to have an available bed for you to be able to use that location. That time frame, though, is going to be limited, and if you don't select that ship, you're going to end up being defaulted to a physical location. Now, as you're waking up from a respawn, the plan is to show you how many times you've died to give you a better idea of how your character is going to be performing and basically how long you have until permadeath kicks in as well. So that's basically the medical plans for the current iterations and the future roadmap, which means things are going to be pretty complicated and in-depth, and really highlight some of the purpose for these medical careers and organizational support. You can almost envision how having a medical ship in a fleet not only acts as a good way to prevent taking on long-term negative effects for your teammates, and how you can support people in a respawn type of situation to keep the fleet going and almost acting as a force multiplier, as well as making sure that your team just isn't getting broken up and you're not having to go pick people up or them transporting back to you. Anyways, if you have questions about any of this, please get them in the comments. Otherwise, thanks for watching. I'll make sure to report on any changes to this as this continues to get fleshed out. Stay tuned for a lot more. Have yourselves a wonderful day, and take care.